Good morning and welcome to Calvary. We will be in Philippians chapter 1 once again. A passage that was read earlier caught my attention in Psalm 90, verse 10. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. I want to think about that a little bit, and considering also the individual who wrote that, who was Moses, thinking of the title here in these few verses of Jesus our Deliverer, I struggled with the title and I gave that one to John Ivan, and I wasn't sure if I should change it or not, but I'll try to keep with it. And I went a slightly different direction than I was intending of what I have this morning. And it's interesting how God is continually working in my thoughts and in preparing things. I try to study and deliver what I see, and sometimes it's easy to get distracted and go down bunny trails of study of certain things, and I had to pull back and try to reevaluate what I was seeing, what God was trying to show me. And this concept of Jesus being a deliverer is kind of where I'm going. And God has always been a deliverer to his people. Throughout the Old Testament, we think of some of the bigger names of Noah and Abraham and Joseph. Moses taking the people of Israel out of Egypt. Throughout the book of Judges, Samson and other judges who were men who stepped up and were used by God to deliver them. And then David as well, who wrote a verse in Psalm 18, verse 2, that is sometimes more popularly attributed to this concept of Jesus, or of God, our deliverer. He says, Psalm 18:2, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." So as we zone back in here, looking at Philippians chapter 1, the context here, as you may remember, is Christ was being proclaimed, and there were some people who were trying to afflict Paul in this proclamation. And his response to that is, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. And then he seems to switch a little bit to his upcoming trial, which he would have been in the jail under house arrest in Rome. And he seems to be contemplating his trial a little bit here. And if he was found guilty, he could be facing execution. So these are weighty things that he is thinking about when he writes these next verses, starting Philippians 1, verse 18, near the end. "Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." I'll just tell you where I'm going. The 3 points I have. The first is that Jesus can deliver us from circumstances, but also to look at that circumstances are tools for our completion or our deliverance, and that completion or deliverance comes through a relationship. So for the first, he says, "For I know that deliverance will come." This phrase that he uses here is basically, he seems to be quoting Job 13, verse 6, in the beginning of that verse, he said in the ESV, "And this shall turn out for my salvation." It seems to be a New Testament translation of that text, what they would have had in the Septuagint. And he says, "I will rejoice." This is a truth that he takes as worthy of joy, coming from a God who is independent of creation and sovereign over it. In Matthew 11:27, Jesus says that all things have been handed over to me by my Father. And Paul in Ephesians 1, verse 22, "And he, God the Father, put all things under his," or Christ's, "feet, and gave him as head over all things." I'm going to look a little bit at this word, "this," which is referring to something. In verse 19, "This will turn out for my deliverance." So what is the "this" he was referring to? We would probably say that it was his summary of his life, all the things that happened to him. Imprisonment, shipwreck. In the previous verses, seeing others that were spiting him. And he says that all of these things will result in deliverance. Deliverance from what? There's two categories or things that I want to think about. He said that he is looking at deliverance from. The first, which is what often we attribute to, is Paul's deliverance from prison. Derek Jeter from Insight for Living says that many scholars believe that Paul was released sometime in AD 62 because the Jews who had accused him of being a real pest and a fellow who stirs up dissension, referenced in Acts 24:5. Those Jews didn't press their case before the emperor for whatever reason. But during Paul, he seems to have a second imprisonment in the Mamertine dungeon, where he had apparently received a preliminary hearing and was awaiting a final trial. And this is referenced more from 2 Timothy 2:4, where he seems to be expecting to be found guilty and executed. The language, I'll read 2 Timothy 4, verse 6. He says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race." That is a different attitude than this. A few verses later here in Philippians 1:24, "But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith." So it does seem, and scholars generally agree, that he was released. So that could be what this leading up to deliverance was talking about. We will look at another something he was seeking deliverance from as well. But he says here in verse 19 that the means of deliverance is not Paul. The means is through the prayers of other people and through the help of the Holy Spirit, or help of the Spirit of Jesus. That being the source of deliverance. Both of those going back to God, coming from God. That was his source, the source of his deliverance, where it would come from. And through these two things, the prayers and help of Christ, Paul felt confident in his release. And he had also been released before, I might remind you, at Philippi, where he's writing this. He was released from there. The Philippians would have remembered this and maybe drawn some interesting conclusions about expecting that. Jesus can deliver from circumstances, but I want to point out that circumstances are tools for our completion. in verse 20, "It is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death." Referencing that this will turn out for deliverance. I want to reference back to verse 6 in Philippians 1, where it says, "I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ." He who began a good work will bring it to completion. He says, eager expectation and hope, that he will not be ashamed. One thing that Paul could expect is found in Matthew 10. Jesus says, "And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and to the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say. For what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." And Paul here was expecting, he had appealed to Caesar, and he was expecting to see Caesar. He was expecting to come before the leaders of Rome and to not be at all ashamed. Paul ashamed? Interesting concept for us to think that. He did write in Romans 1, verse 16, he says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation." I can't help but think that this that Paul was referring to would have included the images that went through his mind at the stoning of Stephen. The dispute that he had with Barnabas about John Mark, where he had to go back later and make amends. Paul had issues and faults, and they could have caused him to be ashamed. I find it interesting, revealing, that Paul's biggest fear here does not seem to be about suffering or pain or prison, but of being ashamed. That was his concern that he had. The word all boldness or full courage is all outspokenness. It's a boldness of speech. A courage specifically that results in speaking. He says, now as always. In the past, he did speak before people of influence and power. Not the emperor, though. And we see that Paul struggles with shame and not wanting to speak of Christ, or struggling with that, of what is going to happen when he does come before the emperor. Paul knows and understands somewhat the temptation of silence. It's easier to be silent than it is speak, especially when it takes courage. But he goes back to the value of prayer, of other people praying for him, and of Christ within him. This in verse 19 is a summary of the experiences through which Paul could be courageous. It took a lot of things together. Courage, he says, that honors Christ. The King James Version says that magnifies Christ through his love and his faithfulness under trial. Acts 9:15 says that Paul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. This kings keeps showing up in Paul's mission, it seems. And he seems to be saying, I don't want to stray from this. I'm keeping watch, and I anticipate, I expect, I hope that I will not be ashamed, that the past will not control his future, that failures will not inhibit his effectiveness of speaking, that there will be no opportunities lost because of shame and of Paul shrinking back. There is a focused confidence, seeking to hold aside or put away distractions, whether they be from pleasures, scars, or fears. His body being honored in his body. His body is the sacrifice, laying down those things. I find it's easy to pray sometimes that Christ be honored or Christ be glorified, but it's a harder thing to say, use me to be glorified, because it requires sacrifice on our part. Paul says and hopes that Christ will be honored by life or death. You could say in living, that equals Christ, where Christ continues using him to advance the church. And in dying, there is gain. A farewell to sufferings and imperfections of earth. I go to see Jesus. Paul found himself in a position where he couldn't lose. He was not fearful of death and what that brought. He was anxious for it, you could say. In Philippians 4, later in the book, Philippians 4:11 says, not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low and how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And what was the secret that Paul had learned? That he would challenge us to learn. Verse 13, very familiar to us. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Through him. The next point I have, the completion or deliverance. The completion in verse 6. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. I believe is found through or comes through relationship. Where he says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. How did he get there? His salvation was not a fire insurance, for starters. He had seen how this, which includes the deliverance from sin, hard events that happened, shame of mistakes that he had made, Jesus walking through that made Jesus valuable to him. According to oceanexplorer.gov, the measurable disturbance of a hurricane only reaches a maximum depth of about 300 feet below the surface of the water, which is approximately the height of the Statue of Liberty. That's a hurricane, crazy stuff happening up top. And yet you go down maximum, a lot of them are less, but a maximum of 300 feet, it's still, there's no turbulence down there. And it's so easy, we can find ourselves, like there's little insects that go on top of water, I don't even know what they are, the little bugs that scoot across the water, spiders or insects, whatever they are. We can find ourselves A little bit like that, where there's little depth, there's no depth, where we go to and fro in life, chasing one pleasure after another. And then something happens that calls us back, calls us to reevaluate what we're doing. You could put Paul in prison and he sings songs. You could, and they did, take away everything that he has in life, and he still possesses an attitude of joy, where he could happily sing the song that says, "You can have all this world, but give me Jesus." I think the second thing that Paul seeks deliverance from, and possibly the primary, is not just from prison, but Paul seeks deliverance from a spiritual incarceration of shame. He sees that shame is where Christ is not honored by Paul. Shame results in an imperfect, Holy Spirit restricted relationship that is based on circumstances and what's going on around him. And in spite of his failures, Paul values his relationship with Jesus, and he desires not to be that shame, or where the Spirit is restricted, and where it doesn't depend on his surroundings. I think he would say that if we struggle with this feeling of shame towards Jesus, that is an invitation to go back to Jesus. One of the things about struggling with, especially emotional or spiritual things, is we want an escape or a coping mechanism. We will find it somewhere. The stresses of life. And he would say, go to Jesus. Not seeking to drown yourself in nicotine or pornography or alcohol or whatever other coping mechanisms the world offers that may help for a moment. But Jesus wants us to face the challenges of life with him in relationship. The value of this that happens in our life, the value of this is to develop over our lifetime a deeper reliance and identity with Jesus, bringing us to the place where we can also say, with Paul, living is Christ and dying is gain. The purpose of this is your sanctification. 1 Thessalonians 4, this is the will of God, your sanctification. That's the goal in it that God has for us. And we see the deliverance, though, is not always immediate. Even if we are asking God for deliverance of whatever kind, it's not always immediate. Paul himself had the thorn in the flesh that he went to God and asked God for relief from it, for God to take it away. But he goes back to this. Jesus will finish what he started in Paul as well. And he will use circumstances, some that stay around, to finish that good work in our lives, in Paul's life. Our prayers that communicate with Jesus, with God, they can help motivate. They are motivating to Jesus to take this and sometimes take it away. And sometimes take it and make it a stepping stone in our journey of sanctification. There's a story out there called The Burning Hut. The Burning Hut, where it goes something like this. The only survivor of a shipwreck washed up on a small, uninhabited island. He prayed earnestly to God for rescue, and every day he searched and looked for help, but none came. He eventually managed to build a little hut out of driftwood, the broken wreckage of his ship, to protect him from the elements and store what few possessions he had. One day, he was scavenging for food again and returned to his hut to find it going up in flames. A great tragedy. Everything he had felt like it was lost. He was struck with grief and anger. God, how could you do this to me? He cried. Early the next day, after sleeping over his disappointments, he awoke with I'll get through this, I think. He awoke with the sound of a ship that was approaching. It had come to rescue him. The weary man asked the ship captain, "How on earth did you ever know I was on this island?" The captain replied, "We saw your smoke signal." God is at work in our suffering. May we not lose heart. When our little hut of possessions is burning down and we're seeing the flames go up in smoke, it may just be a smoke signal that beckons a deeper relationship with Jesus. What we may see as our place of safety that we hold dear on the little island that we have, it may be taken from us. And sometimes it's the only way. But God offers us something greater. In looking back over our life, sometimes we're privileged to see how God has taken this, the unfortunate and fortunate things of life, to bring us to where we are now, but we're not finished. You could take away anything that Paul had, and his response was, Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus. I'm willing to live or willing to die, but give me Jesus. Jesus can deliver us from our circumstances. But circumstances are tools used by God in his sovereignty for our completion. And I think that completion comes through relationship. Rejoice, as Paul does. Rejoice in our deliverer. And pray for deliverance, but more, that God would use what we're seeking deliverance from and use it to grow closer to Jesus. Jesus brings true and lasting and healing life through closer relationship with him, as we can give him our cares and our burdens. I think that success, what is the definition of success that I have written here is that success in any circumstance is when we come out closer to Jesus. Let's pray.